Why was the valley so quiet that morning? It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the kind that made you feel watched. The kind that pressed against your ribs until every breath felt like a question you didn't want to ask. Somewhere out there, between the jagged ridges of Hawkerash Province, someone was already watching them through a scope, and Staff Sergeant Lara Quinn could feel it. For 7 weeks she'd listened to the stories, the ambushes, the phantom shots, the names added one by one to that wall inside Outpost Granite Ridge. 90 faces, 90 soldiers, 90 ghosts. No one ever saw the shooters. No one ever heard them leave. The men started calling the valley the Whisper Range. Some even refused to look toward it during sunrise, afraid the light would catch their helmets and draw fire. But Lara wasn't afraid of being seen. She was afraid of not seeing. When she first stepped into that briefing room, the smell of coffee and cordite still clung to the air. The colonel had been packing in front of the wall of photographs, names, units, coordinates. It wasn't just a wall. It was a wound, and everyone in that room could feel it bleeding. She stood at the back, hands folded, listening. Not interrupting, not volunteering, just observing. That was her way. Always had been. Her eyes moved from one photo to another, tracing patterns no one else saw, the order of dates, the terrain markers, the faces of men who died with radios still in their hands. When Colonel Hayes turned to her, there was exhaustion in his voice. "Staff Sergeant Quinn, you were sent here because no one else can find these bastards. We've lost 90 men. What do you need?" She didn't hesitate. 3 days, a map, and every after-action report you've got. The room went quiet. Captain Rohr scoffed under his breath. 3 days, we've been here 18 months and you think you'll solve it with paperwork. Lara looked at him, not coldly, not with defiance, just steady. Paperwork tells a story if you know how to listen. He shook his head, muttering something about theory, but Hayes wasn't laughing. He'd seen her file, Iraq, Koresh, 3 commendations, 2 recommendations for valor. He'd also seen the note from her last co. If she says she can do it, let her. That night, under a single dim lamp in her tent, Lara spread out 68 reports on the floor, old printouts smudged with fingerprints and dust. She worked silently, cross-referencing attack times, angles, wind direction, even convoy formations. Around her, the desert wind brushed against the canvas, whispering like the ghosts of those who died out there. She remembered something her grandfather used to say: "The ground talks if you listen without pride." Miles Quinn, Marine Corps sniper, Vietnam, Silver Star, her first teacher. He taught her to read the land long before she could even drive. When she was 12, he made her crawl through the tall Wyoming grass and learn how to breathe with the earth, slow, patient, invisible. She used to think he was preparing her for hunting deer. But later, she realized he was teaching her something else: how to hunt what hunts you. On her 13th birthday, he gave her a leather-bound journal, scrawled with sketches of terrain, equations, and handwritten notes in faded blue ink. At the bottom of the last page, he'd written, "The hunter who moves first loses." That night in her tent, Lara had that same journal open beside her reports, her grandfather's handwriting beside her own. 2 lives connected by one philosophy: patience is power. She didn't notice the hours pass. She didn't notice the lamp flickering out. What she did notice, somewhere between 200 and 300, was a pattern no one else had seen. The attacks weren't random. They formed clusters, 3 ridgelines spaced just enough for overlapping fire zones. The timing wasn't random either. Mornings, late afternoons, always during convoy halts or shift changes when movement slowed and attention drifted. They weren't ghosts. They were disciplined, trained, predictable. She sat back, staring at the grid of coordinates she'd drawn. The realization hit her like cold water: they had a system. Every 8 to 10 days, they returned to the same sectors, different perches, but always the same rhythm. She whispered to herself, "You're not invisible, you're habitual." By the time dawn bled through the tent fabric, Lara had her answer. When she walked back into the briefing room, Colonel Hayes was still at the wall, staring at the photographs. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. She handed him her map, hand-drawn, marked in red and blue. "They're cycling positions," she said. "3 primary hide sites. They use overlapping sightlines and exploit the valley's natural cover. I can predict where they'll be next." Hayes frowned, studying the paper. "How certain are you?" 70%. Captain Rohr laughed. 70, not certainty, it's luck. Lara met his gaze. 70 is better than the 0 we've had for 18 months. For a moment the room was still. Then Hayes exhaled and nodded. "You'll go alone. Radio check every 12 hours. You find them, you end it." She just said, "Yes, sir." When she stepped out of the tent before dawn, the horizon was painted in gray-blue light. She carried her M210, a rifle that felt more like an extension of her own heartbeat than a weapon. Winchester Magnum, reliable, lethal beyond 1,000 meters. She'd named it Quiet. Her rucksack carried 4 days of rations, water, the spotting scope, and her grandfather's journal, wrapped in a torn piece of his old Marine uniform. She tucked it into the side pocket, close to her ribs. The climb took hours. The rock scraped her palms, the dust filled her lungs, and the sun rose like a furnace behind her. She moved slow, steady, blending with the wind and the color of the mountain itself. By midday she reached her perch, a narrow ridge overlooking the valley. From there she could see the main road where convoys crawled like metal ants below. She dug her hide shallow, just enough to shield her outline. She camouflaged it with brush and set her scope. The afternoon sun would stay at her back, blinding anyone who tried to spot her. Then she waited. Waiting was something Lara Quinn understood better than most. In a world that rewarded action, she had learned the power of stillness. Each breath became a count, each shift of wind a whisper, each echo a warning. Day 1, nothing. Day 2, movement. A patrol moved through the valley. Then gunfire, 2 shots, 2 men down. Her heart clenched, but she stayed still. The sound came from her north, about 800 meters out. She tracked it through her scope but saw nothing but heat shimmer. The shooters were ghosts again. Night fell heavy. She didn't sleep. The radio crackled every few hours, status check-ins, coordinates, names. She spoke little. Her voice stayed calm, controlled, like her grandfathers had been on hunting trips even when storms rolled in. Day 3, stillness. No fire, just wind. She began to doubt her own pattern. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the valley had changed its rules. But then on day 4, just past 1500 hours, she saw it, the faintest flicker of movement on the rocks. 2 figures. Slow, deliberate, cautious. They weren't locals. Their gear was too clean, their coordination too precise. One carried a Dragunov rifle, the other a spotting scope and a small radio. Lara felt her pulse slow, not rise, slow. That was how she knew she was ready. She marked their distance, 610 meters. Wind, northwest, 8 to 10 mph. Elevation difference, 40 meters. Temperature, mid-80s. She adjusted her scope, accounting for the mirage shimmer that danced between them. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her head. If you take 2 targets, you do it fast, or you don't do it at all. The spotter leaned forward, adjusting his stance for barely 3 seconds. Lara exhaled halfway. The crosshairs steadied on his chest. 1 shot. Bolt cycle. 2nd shot. 2 bodies slumped almost in unison. Then nothing. Silence. Not the fearful kind this time, the kind that meant peace. She held her position, eyes locked through the scope for 30 long minutes, waiting for movement. None came. When she finally keyed her radio, her voice was steady. 2 enemy combatants neutralized, coordinates transmitted. Command acknowledged. She didn't move. Not yet. She waited until the clearing team arrived hours later. Through her scope, she watched them confirm the kills: 1 Dragunov rifle, 1 Chinese spotting scope, 1 radio, 1 notebook. She exhaled softly, The notebook mattered. Notes meant systems. Systems meant others. Later, intel confirmed the pair were part of a three-man sniper cell, responsible for nearly 40 of the 90 deaths. 2 weeks later, a drone strike eliminated the third. And the valley fell silent. For 6 months, no new names were added to that wall. Convoys rolled freely. Patrols stopped flinching at shadows. Soldiers began to laugh again during breakfast. But Lara didn't celebrate. She just cleaned her rifle, packed her kit, and stared out toward the ridges, quiet, empty now, and wondered how many other valleys were whispering the same pain somewhere else in the world. When they pinned the bronze star to her chest 2 months later, she didn't say much. Captain Rohr shook her hand, apologized for doubting her. She smiled faintly, not out of pride, out of understanding. Because war doesn't end with medals. It ends when the silence feels earned. Years later at Camp Windmere, she'd repeat her grandfather's words to every young sniper who came through her class. Tell them about patience, about reading the wind, about never letting anger pull the trigger. But she never told them about the 90 faces on that wall, or about the way the valley sounded the moment it went quiet. That silence belonged to the fallen. And to her. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. How do you return from a place that never really lets you go? 3 months after the valley went silent, Lara Quinn stood on a small airstrip in Wyoming, the same wind blowing across the same grass she used to crawl through as a kid. The mountains still cut the horizon in half. The light still fell the same way across the field, but everything felt quieter, not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. Her deployment had ended. The papers were signed, the medals pinned, the photographs archived. To everyone else, the story was over. But to Lara, it was still unfolding in her chest like a shot that never stopped echoing. When she stepped off that plane, her mother hugged her tight enough to bruise. Her father, a man of few words, just nodded, eyes red, jaw tight. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. They saw it in her face, that stillness, that distance. Like she'd left something behind in those mountains and hadn't decided if she wanted it back. That night her old room felt too clean, too normal. The walls were pale blue, lined with high school trophies and a few framed photos, her and her grandfather on the shooting range, him smiling behind his old Marine cap. She sat on the edge of the bed, the bronze star still in her hand. It didn't shine like it had during the ceremony. It looked heavier now. She placed it on the nightstand and stared at the old journal she'd carried through the desert. Miles Quinn's handwriting was still as sharp as the first day she'd read it. She flipped through the pages, tracing his notes with her finger about wind drift, light refraction, patience. But tonight, those words didn't feel like lessons. They felt like warnings. The hunter who moves first loses. She whispered it to herself, then closed the book. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the house sounded like a radio crackle. Every gust of wind outside carried the faint echo of distant gunfire. And somewhere in the half-light of her dreams, she saw them again, the two men on the ridge, the glint of their scope, the brief moment before silence. When she woke, the sun was spilling through the window, warm and ordinary. But she didn't feel ordinary. She felt suspended, caught between two worlds that didn't understand each other. The Army called a few weeks later reassignment to Camp Windmere, Training Division. "Instructor Quinn," the voice on the line said, "you'll be teaching marksmanship and fieldcraft, stateside duty." She accepted, not because she wanted to teach, but because she couldn't stand the stillness of home. The walls felt too small, the quiet too loud. At Windmere, the days had structure again. Classes started early, cadets lined up in the dust, rifles slung, eyes nervous. Most of them were 20 or 21, eager, raw, unscarred. They treated her like a legend. "The sniper from Vadran Gorge," they whispered. "The woman who stopped the ghosts." She hated that title. She didn't stop ghosts. She stopped men. Men who breathed, bled, and had their own stories. That was the part no one wanted to hear. One afternoon, a young trainee asked her during a break, "Ma'am, how do you stay calm when you pull the trigger?" Lara looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You don't. You just learn to breathe through the parts that scare you." He didn't fully understand. He nodded anyway, the way soldiers do when they want to look brave. Later, alone at the range, she adjusted her scope and lined up a shot just for herself. 600 yards, 700. She took a slow breath, half exhale, squeeze. The target dropped cleanly, perfect shot. But instead of pride, she felt something else, emptiness. Because every perfect shot meant something imperfect had happened somewhere else. That night she sat in her quarters with the old journal open again. For the first time, she noticed smudges in the margin, faint ink stains shaped like fingerprints. Her grandfather, maybe, or hers. She turned to the last page. Beneath, "The hunter who moves first loses." There was a small line she'd never paid attention to before, scrawled sideways near the edge. "But the one who never moves at all forgets why he was hunting." She froze. Maybe he'd added it later. Maybe it was just something he'd written for himself. But it hit her like a confession that even the patient ones, the disciplined ones, could lose themselves in stillness. The next morning she drove into town before sunrise. The diner was half empty, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. The waitress, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, recognized her uniform immediately. "You're the Quinn girl, ain't you? Miles' granddaughter." Lara nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The woman smiled softly. "He used to come here after the war. Never said much. Just sat at that corner booth, wrote in his notebook, and watched the door like he was waiting for someone who never showed up." Lara's throat tightened. "He was waiting," she said quietly. "He just didn't know what for." After that, Windmere became her rhythm. The recruits came and went. The sound of rifles cracking across the range filled her days. The silence of empty rooms filled her nights. But once in a while, a letter would come from Colonel Hayes, from old comrades in Koresh, from families of the soldiers who died. Most thanked her. Some just wanted to tell her that the valley was quiet now. Every time she read those words, "The valley is quiet now," she felt both peace and pain. Because silence, she'd learned, isn't always a victory. Sometimes it's just the sound of everything that's gone. 6 months into her new post, she got called into the commander's office. Lieutenant Colonel Barrett, tall, tired eyes, gentle voice. He told her they wanted her to lead an advanced sniper seminar for experienced marksmen. "Your field record speaks for itself," he said. "We want them learning from the best." She wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell him that the best still woke up at 3 a.m. staring at invisible ridges in the dark, but she just nodded. "Yes, sir." The seminar was small, 12 soldiers, all combat veterans. Their faces carried the same look she saw in her mirror every morning, that half-buried weariness that doesn't fade with sleep. She taught them how to track patterns, how to find stillness in chaos. She made them repeat one phrase every morning before drills: "Observation saves lives." But what she didn't teach, what she couldn't teach, was how to carry the weight after you've done the saving. One evening, after the final day of training, a corporal lingered behind. His name was Ruiz. He looked young, but his eyes weren't. He waited until the others left, then said, "Ma'am, how do you forget?" Lara paused, pretending to check her gear. "Forget what?" "The faces," he said softly. "The ones you couldn't save, the ones you had to stop." She didn't answer right away. The air between them felt thick, heavy with things neither could say out loud. Then she looked at him. "You don't. You just learn which memories to carry without dropping them." He nodded, eyes glassy, and left. That night she walked out past the range. The wind was sharp, the stars impossibly clear. She looked up at the sky and whispered her grandfather's line again. But this time it didn't sound like a rule. It sounded like a burden passed down. "The hunter who moves first loses." But what if the hunter never stops moving? Over the next few months, word spread that she'd been requested for another overseas advisory rotation. Just training, no field combat. But even hearing the word deployment made something stir inside her. Not fear, not excitement, something else, unfinishedness. She never told anyone, but she still dreamed of that valley, not as it was bloody and cruel, but as it became afterward, silent, untouched, a place that refused to forget. One night after another long day of teaching, she sat in her quarters and pulled out her grandfather's journal again. The edges were frayed now, the leather worn soft by heat and sand. Inside the back cover, she found something she'd never noticed before, a folded scrap of paper, almost invisible against the binding. She unfolded it carefully. It was a small Polaroid, a much younger Miles Quinn, sitting on a hillside somewhere in Vietnam, rifle resting across his knees. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were calm. On the back of the photo, written in faded ink, were just 3 words. "We found peace." Lara stared at it for a long time. Then she looked around her empty room, the medals, the maps, the training schedules, and realized she didn't know if she ever would. When the new orders came through, she didn't tell anyone right away. She just packed quietly, setting the photo inside the journal inside her kit. Outside, the wind picked up again, rolling through the Wyoming grass the same way it had when she was a child learning to crawl through it, the same way it had whispered through the Vadran Gorge. She zipped up her pack and glanced at the bronze star on the shelf. Then she turned away. Some wars don't end when the fighting stops. They just learn how to live inside you. And sometimes, the silence that follows isn't peace. It's just the echo of who you were before the first shot was fired. Why did she say yes again? That question followed Lara all the way to the flight line. The plane's engine screamed behind her, rotors chopping through the Afghan dust like blades through smoke. She should have stayed at Camp Windmere, teaching recruits how to breathe between seconds. But when command asked for an experienced sniper instructor to advise local units on counter-sniper strategy, her name was the first one on the list. She didn't hesitate, she just said, "When do we leave?" The young lieutenant handing her the orders said, "You'll only be there for a few months, ma'am. Strictly advisory." Strictly, she'd heard that word before. As she stepped onto the C-130, the air felt too familiar, that dry, metallic scent of oil and heat. The same weight pressed against her chest, a memory that wasn't supposed to be fresh anymore. She sat by the window, watching the runway lights blur into streaks as they lifted off. And somewhere between the hum of the engines and the vibration in the hull, the question returned. Why did she say yes again? Maybe it was guilt, maybe duty. Maybe the unfinished whisper of those 90 faces on the wall that still watched her when she closed her eyes. She didn't know. The mission was in a place called Murrin Valley, a patch of mountains scarred by old fights and new politics. The terrain looked different from Korash, but the air carried the same tension, the same hum before the storm. Her new team wasn't hers, not really. She was just the American advisor. The others were Afghan National Army soldiers, quiet, proud, worn thin by too many years of conflict. They didn't talk much during the first week. They watched her from a distance, respectful but cautious. A woman in their ranks, a foreign sniper, it unsettled tradition. She didn't force familiarity, she just worked. On the second morning, she took her place beside their lead marksman, Sergeant Amir, a man in his late 30s with tired eyes and a beard streaked with gray. He was precise, calm, and humble, everything a sniper should be. He said little until their third patrol together, when they set up on a ridge overlooking a valley road. The wind was high and the light harsh. They sat for hours without a word. Then Amir finally asked, "You have killed many men, yes?" Lara didn't look at him. "Enough." He nodded slowly. "Does it ever stop?" She glanced at him, unsure. "The killing." He shook his head. "The remembering." She took a long breath. "No, but sometimes it gets quieter." He didn't ask more. But from then on, he looked at her differently, not as an outsider, but as someone who understood the language that only silence speaks. Weeks passed. Their work was mostly observation and training. Lara analyzed shooting sites, advised patrol routes, recalibrated local optics. It was supposed to be simple, but simplicity doesn't survive long in places like Murren. One morning during a routine recon brief, a junior soldier came in pale-faced, clutching a radio. Patrol 6, sniper fire near the southern ridge, 2 men down. The room froze. Lara's stomach turned. She looked at the map, at the red circle marking the last engagement zone. It was almost poetic, the same topography she'd seen before in Koresh. 3 ridgelines, overlapping sightlines, predictable patterns. She felt her pulse slow again, the way it always did when fear disguised itself as focus. Colonel Rafik, the Afghan commander, turned to her. "Can you find them?" She didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the map, tracing the contour lines with her finger. She saw it, the familiar rhythm, the patient predator. "They're trained," she said softly. "Not insurgents, not amateurs. These are professionals, maybe the same kind of men I faced before." Rafik frowned. "You think they're foreign?" "I think they're deliberate." By dusk, she and Amir were already in the field, tracking from a distance. The valley fell into that haunting silence again, the same one she remembered from the gorge. It wasn't fear that crawled through it. It was anticipation. They moved through low brush, scanning ridges through thermal optics. The sun slipped below the mountains, and the world turned bronze and blue. Then came the first shot. It wasn't close, maybe 700 meters, but it was precise. Aimed, purposeful. They hit one of Rafik's spotter teams along the western slope. Lara dropped, glassed the ridge. Nothing, just rocks and heat shimmer. Her mind clicked back into the rhythm she'd sworn she'd left behind. Distance, wind, line of fire, escape routes. She whispered, "They're using staggered hides, same tactics as before." Amir crouched beside her, same ghost. She shook her head slowly. "Maybe a student." That night they retreated to base with 1 wounded, 1 dead. Lara barely spoke during debrief. The room buzzed with frustration and disbelief. Talk of phantoms, cursed ground, bad luck. But she knew better. Patterns don't haunt you unless someone's repeating them. She spread the reports out across her bunk, marking coordinates with the stub of a pencil. Same rotation, same timing, same discipline. She felt the ghost of her grandfather's handwriting whispering from the pages of his old journal. Every enemy thinks he's the hunter until he meets the one who truly waits. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, she had drawn a crude map of predicted engagement zones. When she showed it to Rafik, he frowned. "You are sure?" "70%, she said. He smiled faintly. "I have heard you say that before." The next day, Lara and Amir set out early, climbing into position before dawn. The valley below was veiled in mist. Every sound seemed magnified, pebbles shifting, the metallic click of a bolt, the distant call of a bird. Hours passed, nothing. Then through her scope, she caught it, the faint silhouette of a man adjusting his rifle, half hidden behind boulders. Another figure crouched beside him with a radio. Her chest tightened. They were good, calm, methodical, just like she'd been. Amir whispered, "You see them?" "Yes," she murmured. 600 meters, 2-man team, same formation." He exhaled. "We wait." She hesitated. Her finger hovered above the trigger guard. Her heartbeat slowed. The crosshairs drifted just slightly over the target's chest. And then through the scope, she saw something that stopped her breath, a small insignia patch on the man's shoulder. Not military, not Afghan, something else. A faded emblem, a scorpion, coiled and striking. She knew that symbol. It was the mark of an unofficial contractor unit, private snipers used during the height of the Vadran conflict. She'd read about them. One of the three-man cells in Koresh had been rumored to have ties to that group. Her pulse spiked. The third man who escaped the drone strike. Her mouth went dry. What if he hadn't died? What if he just disappeared, moved valleys, changed names, found new allies? Her hand steadied again, but this time not out of calm, out of something colder. Amir noticed, "You know them." She nodded slowly. "I know what they are." The radio crackled softly in the valley below. One of the enemy snipers spoke, faint, distorted. Lara couldn't catch the words, but she recognized the rhythm. That same quiet confidence. That same calm before death. She adjusted her scope. Her breath came steady. Then she whispered to herself, the same words her grandfather had taught her, the ones that always brought her clarity. The hunter who moves first loses. She didn't move, not yet. Through the scope, she watched as the second man shifted, passing something, a notebook. The same kind she'd recovered years ago. It was almost poetic, almost cruel. She waited until their attention broke, a fraction of a second, a breath between focus and rest. Then she exhaled and squeezed. 1. Bolt cycle. 2. The second man crumpled forward, falling into the same dirt he'd studied for weeks. The radio went dead. Amir said nothing. He just stared down at the valley, jaw clenched. When the silence settled again, Lara whispered, "Not ghosts, just habits that refuse to die." Back at base, Command confirmed what she already knew: the patch, the gear, the notebook. The same unit. The same system. The last echo of an old war that never quite ended. That night she sat outside the command tent, rifle propped against the wall, staring at the stars. The desert air was thin and dry. She could hear faint laughter from the barracks, the clatter of dishes, life moving on as if nothing had happened. But inside her something cracked. It wasn't victory she felt. It was exhaustion, because for every ghost she silenced, another always seemed to rise from the same dust. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the Polaroid, her grandfather, sitting in the grass, the words "We found peace" fatting on the back. She stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "Did you? Because I haven't." Amir found her there an hour later, still staring at the horizon. "You did good today," he said. She shook her head slowly. "Good doesn't bring anyone back." He hesitated. "Maybe not, but it keeps others from joining them." She didn't reply, just watched the sky until the stars began to fade. When she finally stood, she felt that strange stillness again, the same kind that followed the shot in Vadran Gorge, the same kind that filled every victory that didn't feel like one. War, she thought, isn't about who shoots first or who shoots last. It's about who can live with the silence that follows. And for people like her, silence wasn't peace, it was punishment. What happens to a soldier when the mission ends, but the war keeps whispering her name? Lara didn't know when the nightmare started again. Maybe they never stopped, maybe they just waited for her to come back. After Murren Valley, her orders were simple: debrief, rotate stateside, resume instructor duties. But nothing about returning felt like rotation. It felt like exile. At Camp Windmere, the world had kept turning. New trainees filled the barracks, laughter echoing through the hallways, rifles cracking at the range. Life didn't pause for anyone, not even those who came back with silence in their eyes. She walked the same hallways she'd left months earlier, the same posters of old heroes staring down from the walls. But something in her had shifted, subtly, invisibly. She didn't belong in the noise anymore. Her colleagues tried to welcome her back. "Heard you took care of business again, Quinn," one instructor said. "Guess lightning does strike twice." She smiled faintly, just enough to be polite, but inside she felt nothing. No pride, no satisfaction, just the dull ache of repetition, of being pulled back into the same loop she thought she'd escaped. That night she sat alone in the empty classroom after everyone had gone. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, washing everything in pale fluorescence. She opened her grandfather's journal again. The pages were worn thin, the ink fading, but one sentence stood out in the dim light. "The land remembers." She ran her thumb over the words. The land, not the people, not the soldiers, the land. Maybe that's why she couldn't forget, because the mountains remembered for her. The nightmares weren't cinematic, no explosions, no blood. They were quieter. She'd dream of wind moving through a valley, the faint crack of a rifle, the moment before the sound reached her. Sometimes she'd wake up with her hand half closed, as if still holding a trigger. She didn't tell anyone. She just worked longer hours, stayed later at the range, volunteered for night watch whenever possible. She told herself she was fine, soldiers always did. But fine was a word people used when they were breaking in private. One evening, as she was locking up the armory, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "You're still chasing ghosts, aren't you?" She turned. Captain Rohr stood in the doorway, the same man who'd once called her plan a waste of time in Koresh. He looked older now, lines cutting deeper across his face, uniform faded. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said. "I'm up for a rotation. Logistics," he replied, leaning against the frame. "Heard about Murrin, hell of a thing." Lara shrugged. "Just another job." He studied her quietly. "That's what I used to tell myself." She didn't respond. He took a step closer. "Listen, Quinn, you've done more than most people could stomach, but I've seen your eyes before. You keep chasing patterns and you're gonna forget which ones are real." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not chasing anything." He smiled sadly. "Then why do you look like you're waiting for someone to shoot at you again?" She turned away, busying herself with a stack of reports, but his words lingered long after he left. That night she couldn't sleep. The room felt too quiet again, that kind of quiet that wasn't peace but pressure. She sat by the window, moonlight cutting across the floor like rifle flashes, and pulled out the Polaroid of her grandfather. "We found peace." She whispered, "Where?" The next morning she showed up at the range before dawn. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that bit your lungs with every breath. She set up targets, adjusted her scope, and began to fire. Every shot echoed across the empty field, rolling out into the fog like thunder. One shot perfect. Another center mass. Another and another. By the 10th round, she stopped. Not because she missed, because she realized she couldn't remember the last time she shot without hearing someone's name attached to it. When she lowered the rifle, her hands were trembling. That same week, the base psychologist requested her presence, routine reintegration evaluation, the email said. She almost ignored it, but protocol didn't care about pride. The office smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. The man behind the desk wore no rank insignia, just a name tag that said Dr. Ellison. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like someone who'd listened to too many of them. "So, Staff Sergeant," he began, "how are you adjusting?" Lara gave the default answer, "Fine." He smiled gently. "You know, every time I hear that word, I start a stopwatch in my head, because usually within 5 minutes, fine becomes something else." She didn't smile back. He leaned forward slightly. "You've had quite a career. 2 sniper cells neutralized, numerous advisory commendations. But tell me, how do you define success?" She hesitated. "When people stop dying." He nodded. "And when they do?" "Then I work harder." He studied her face. "What happens when working harder doesn't stop the dying?" She looked away. "Then you learn to live with it." The session ended early. He said she was fit for continued service, but his eyes said otherwise. That night she skipped dinner, walking the perimeter fence instead. The sound of her boots crunching gravel became her rhythm, her heartbeat. Beyond the fence, the field stretched out into darkness. Somewhere far off, coyotes howled. For a moment she imagined she was back on that ridge. The same air, the same silence, the same weight pressing against her chest. She closed her eyes, and she heard it again, that faint echo, the whisper that started it all. "Who's hunting us?" Her eyes snapped open. There was no one there, just the empty field, the quiet hum of floodlights, the soft creak of the wire fence. But her pulse didn't slow for a long time. Days turned into weeks. The nightmares deepened, but she learned to function around them. That's what soldiers do: adapt, compartmentalize, survive. She threw herself into teaching again, running field exercises, correcting posture, drilling her students until their hands shook from fatigue. One of the younger recruits, a girl named Turner, reminded Lara of herself at 19. Steady aim, quiet presence, that same hunger to prove something. After class one afternoon, Turner approached her. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Lara nodded. "Is it true," Turner said softly, "that you once waited 4 days for a shot?" Lara almost smiled. 4 days, 3 nights, 2 cans of cold rations, the longest silence of my life. Turner looked awestruck. "How did you stay focused that long?" "I didn't focus," Lara said. "I just listened." "To what?" "The land, the wind, my own fear." Turner frowned. "You were afraid." "Always," Lara said. "That's how you know you're still human." The words slipped out before she could stop them. For the first time in months, they felt honest. After Turner left, Lara stayed by the range, watching the sun fall behind the trees. The light turned gold, then amber, then gone. She sat there long after dark, until the air grew cold enough to sting. Then she took out the journal and opened it to a blank page. For the first time, she started to write her own notes, not about ballistics or trajectories, but about the things she couldn't say out loud. She wrote about silence, about guilt, about the strange calm that comes when the world is burning, about how it's possible to save lives and lose yourself in the same breath. She wrote until the pen ran dry. Then she closed the book and whispered into the night, "You were right, Grandpa. The hunter who moves first loses, but sometimes the hunter who never stops loses more." She didn't cry, she couldn't. But the next morning, when the recruits lined up for training, they noticed something different in her tone. Softer, slower, more human. She stopped mid-lecture, looked out over the range, and said quietly, "Every bullet carries a question. You'd better know your answer before you pull that trigger." No one spoke. The wind carried her voice across the line like a sermon. Later that day, she placed her bronze star in a small wooden box at the back of her locker, right beside her grandfather's journal. She didn't need either of them any more to remember. That night she stood outside under the open sky, the stars clear and sharp. For once she didn't hear echoes, no gunfire, no ghosts, just the slow rhythm of her own breathing. Maybe that was peace, or maybe it was just the space between wars. She didn't know. But as she looked toward the horizon, she whispered to herself, almost like a promise, "One day I'll stop hunting what's already gone." Why do we always wait for peace to feel like silence, when sometimes it sounds like purpose instead? For months, Lara Quinn lived quietly at Camp Windmere, moving through her days like someone learning to walk again after years of running. Her classes grew smaller, more focused. The base trusted her with the advanced trainees, the ones who'd already seen enough to stop asking loud questions. She liked those soldiers, the quiet ones, the ones who didn't confuse calm with weakness. Every morning at 500, she'd step out onto the range before the sun touched the targets. The dew clung to the grass, the air smelled faintly of oil and dust, and the world felt balanced, still enough to breathe. For the first time in years, she found a rhythm that didn't depend on gunfire. Her students noticed the way she carried herself, not with authority but with weight. She wasn't the kind of instructor who shouted. She didn't need to. When she spoke, everyone listened because she spoke like someone who'd earned her words one bullet at a time. "Patience isn't waiting," she'd tell them. "It's knowing when waiting ends." They didn't always understand, but they remembered. Her reputation had become legend across the base. The woman who hunted the hunters, they called her. It embarrassed her more than it flattered her. She wasn't proud of what she'd done, she was proud of what she'd learned. That pride was quiet, the kind you didn't wear on a uniform. By early autumn, she'd begun to sleep through the nights again, not soundly, but long enough to wake without the echoes of rifle cracks in her ears. The nightmares had softened into memories, the kind she could watch from a distance without flinching. She spent her weekends repairing old rifles from the armory, her fingers tracing the grooves of metal like familiar scars. There was comfort in maintenance, in fixing what could still be restored. It was during one of those quiet evenings that the letter arrived. A single white envelope postmarked from overseas. No unit stamp, no return address, just her name. Staff Sergeant Lara Quinn, Camp Winmere, U.S. Army Training Command. Her stomach tightened before she even opened it. Letters like that never carried good news. Inside was a short handwritten note, the kind of brevity that carried weight. Granite Ridge, Outpost Memorial this November. They're dedicating the wall. Colonel Hayes requested your presence. He said it wouldn't be right without you. CPT, roar. She read it twice. The words didn't fully register until she whispered them aloud, Granite Ridge. The name hit her like the echo of a shot long delayed. She sat there for a while, staring at the paper, feeling her pulse shift. Granite Ridge, the outpost where it all began. The wall with 90 faces. The place where silence became her teacher. She thought she'd buried that valley years ago. But here it was again, knocking like a memory that refused to stay dead. That night she didn't sleep. She walked the perimeter fence again, the same rhythm of boots on gravel, the same cold breath of night. But instead of ghosts, her mind replayed moments, faces, details, voices. The soldiers she'd never met but whose fates had shaped hers. She remembered the day the wall was filled edge to edge. The look in Hayes' eyes when he asked her for a plan. The tremor in Captain Rohr's voice when he called her crazy for thinking she could solve it. And she remembered the silence after her final shot. The quiet that didn't feel like victory, just stillness. The next morning, she packed her duffel bag before sunrise. The letter was folded inside the journal, tucked between the old notes in her grandfather's faded handwriting. Her commanding officer tried to dissuade her. You don't have to go, Quinn. You've done your part. But she just said, some debts don't expire. The flight to Afghanistan felt shorter this time. Maybe because she didn't expect answers anymore. Maybe because she knew ghosts travel faster than planes. When the helicopter set down at the rebuilt Granite Ridge, the air hit her like a memory. The base had changed, new walls, new paint, new faces. But beneath it all, she could still feel the bones of the old one. Colonel Hayes was there, standing near the memorial wall. He looked older, grayer, slower in his steps, but his eyes were the same. The kind of eyes that had seen too much and never stopped counting. Sergeant Quinn, he said, voice rough but steady. Sir. They stood in silence for a moment, both looking at the wall. 90 names carved into steel, polished and cold. Hayes exhaled. It took them years to get the funding. Guess the government finally decided ghosts deserve concrete. Lara's lips tightened into something that might have been a smile. Ghosts always get attention once they're quiet enough. He nodded. I meant what I said in that letter. It wouldn't be right without you. She traced her finger along the names, pausing when she reached the first, PFC Darren Cole. She didn't know him, but she'd studied the report that carried his name 100 times. The first victim in the gorge. The one that started it all. I used to think this wall would make it easier, Hayes said softly. But standing here, it just feels heavier. Because it's supposed to, she said. Weight keeps us honest. The ceremony was small. No press. Just a few surviving unit members, a handful of officers, and a folded flag placed beneath the memorial. When the speeches ended, when the cameras shut off, Most people drifted toward the mess tent. Lara stayed behind. She stood in front of the wall until the last shadow disappeared behind the ridgeline. The air grew colder, quieter. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Captain Roar. He looked worn but lighter than before. "Never thought I'd see this place again," he said. "Neither did I." They stood side by side, staring at the names. He said quietly, "You ever wonder why it was you who stopped it? Not luck, not chance, you." She shook her head. "I wasn't better, I just listened longer." He smiled faintly. "You still do that, don't you? Listen when everyone else talks." She didn't answer. After a long pause, he reached into his pocket and handed her something, a small brass casing, polished clean. "Found this near the southern ridge during Reconstruction," he said. "We think it's one of yours." She took it gently. It was light, harmless now, just a piece of spent metal, but holding it felt like touching the past. She closed her fist around it. "Funny," she said quietly, "how something that once carried death can feel this empty." "Maybe that's what peace is," Roar said, "the emptiness that stops hurting." She looked at him. "Does it ever stop?" He thought about it, then shook his head. "No, but it changes shape." That night she stayed in the old barracks, rebuilt, repainted, but the air still carried the scent of dust and memory. She lay awake listening to the wind brush against the tin roof, the same way it had the night before her first mission here. Sleep came slow, heavy but deep, and for the first time the dream was different. No rifle, no ridge, no scope. Just her grandfather sitting beside her in the Wyoming grass, the sun warm on their faces. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. When she woke at dawn, the light spilling through the cracks in the wall felt softer somehow. She packed her gear slowly, placed the brass casing inside her journal, and stepped outside. Hayes was there again, waiting near the chopper, heading home. She nodded for now. He looked at her for a long moment. "You ever figure out why you keep coming back?" She smiled faintly. "Because I still hear the echoes, and I'm not sure they're done talking." He didn't argue, just saluted. She returned it, crisp, quiet, final. As the helicopter lifted off, the outpost grew smaller beneath her, the ridges, the wall, the ghosts. She watched until it all blurred into distance. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out the old photo of her grandfather, and flipped it over. "We found peace." She whispered, "I'm starting to understand what you meant." Below her the land stretched on forever, scarred, silent, beautiful. And for once that silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like truth. Why do we see ourselves most clearly in someone else's mistakes? When Lara returned from Granite Ridge, Camp Windmere felt both smaller and quieter, like time itself had softened around the edges. She thought the visit would bring closure. Instead, it left her with an ache she couldn't name. Not pain exactly, not regret. Something between them, a slow, pulsing weight that whispered, "What now?" Teaching helped, it always had. Every week brought new trainees, faces fresh with purpose, uniforms still stiff from storage. Most were too young to remember the wars that shaped her. To them, she wasn't a soldier. She was a story. And that was the problem. Stories end, people don't. One cold morning in January, she met the recruit who would unsettle everything she thought she'd learned about peace. Private First Class Eli Parker, 22, lean, restless eyes, an arrogance that came not from pride but pain. He had that look she'd seen too many times before, someone who'd lost something and was trying to shoot his way through the silence it left behind. From the first day, she knew he was dangerous, not to others but to himself. During target drills, he never missed. His breathing was steady, posture precise, aim unwavering. But when he lowered the rifle, there was something hollow behind his calm, like the moment before a storm breaks. After the third session, she walked down the line and stopped behind him. "Good grouping," she said. He didn't look up. "Good's not enough." Her tone sharpened. In this job, good keeps people alive. He set the rifle down gently, and perfect keeps you from losing them. That silence, the one that followed, hit her deeper than she expected. Later, reviewing scores in her office, she noticed something else. Eli's training file listed him as an orphan dependent. His father, a Marine, had been killed in Korash province 10 years earlier. The same region she'd fought in. The same time frame. She stared at the date on the report, pulse slowing. It couldn't be coincidence. That night she searched old mission logs. The system was fragmented, many reports redacted or incomplete. But one after-action file stood out: a patrol ambushed outside Vadran Gorge, 12 Marines, sniper fire from elevated ground. One casualty, Sergeant Daniel Parker. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled down. The ambush had been part of the same chain of attacks her mission later ended. Eli Parker's father had been one of the 90. She closed the file slowly, leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The air in the room felt heavy, claustrophobic. How do you tell someone you stopped the man who killed their father, but only after he was already gone? You don't. The next morning she ran drills as usual, her tone measured, detached. But every time Eli raised his rifle, she saw echoes of her own past: the posture, the stillness, the hunger for precision. After class, she called him in. He stood straight, hands behind his back. "Ma'am." "At ease," she said. "Tell me something, Parker. Why sniper school?" He hesitated. "Because it's the only place patience feels like control." She studied him. "You think patience is control?" "I think it's the illusion of it," he said quietly. "And I like illusions." Lara didn't smile. She saw too much of herself in that answer. "You lost your father," she said gently. His eyes flicked up. "You read my file." "I did." He looked away, jaw tight. "They said he died fast. I don't believe them. He was too smart to die fast." Her throat tightened. "Sometimes being smart doesn't save you. It just means you understand what's happening before everyone else." He frowned, unsure if she was speaking from experience. "I'm not here to talk about him," he said finally. "I'm here to make sure no one ends up like him." She nodded slowly. "That's a noble reason." He held her gaze. "Was that your reason too?" The question caught her off guard. She could have lied, could have said yes, but the truth had lived too long in silence. "I used to think so," she said. "Then I realized I was just trying to quiet something inside me, something that didn't like to lose." He didn't reply, just nodded once sharply and left. For weeks after that, their dynamic shifted: less instructor and student, more mirror and reflection. She pushed him harder than the others. He didn't complain. If anything, he welcomed it. During one night exercise, they spent hours tracking simulated targets across the range. The moon was a thin silver sliver, the air cold enough to sting their lungs. She whispered, "Wind shifting south by 5 knots, adjust 2 clicks." He replied without looking up, "Already did." She almost smiled. "Don't get cocky." "Just listening," he said, "like you taught us." Something about that word, listening, hit her differently now. When the final shot echoed across the field, it was perfect. The kind of precision you can't teach. She exhaled slowly. "You're good." He looked at her, eyes calm but unreadable. "You mean dangerous?" "Same thing in the wrong hands," she said quietly. He didn't argue. The following week, a storm hit the base: heavy winds, sheets of rain cutting across the field. Training was suspended. Lara used the downtime to review evaluations. Most of the recruits were average, a few promising. But Eli's file glared like a red mark: exceptional scores, exceptional control, and a note from another instructor: emotionally detached. Potential concern. That phrase, emotionally detached, sat with her all night. She knew what it looked like, what it felt like. The numbness mistaken for focus. The calm that wasn't calm at all, just the absence of feeling. The next day she found him at the range, shooting in the rain, alone. "You're supposed to be inside," she called. He didn't stop. The rifle barked, echoing against the empty bleachers. "I don't miss," he said flatly, "not even when the wind lies." She walked closer, rain soaking through her jacket. "You think hitting a target in the rain makes you ready for war?" He lowered the rifle, water dripping from his sleeves. "No, but it reminds me why I'm not afraid of it." Lara studied him, the way his jaw set, the way his eyes didn't blink when thunder rolled. "Afraid and ready aren't the same thing," she said softly. "Fear keeps you human. Readiness just keeps you alive." He looked at her for a long time. "Which one are you?" The question cut deeper than he knew. She didn't answer. 2 days later, he was gone. Not AWOL, reassigned. Advanced Training Detachment Overseas Advisory Unit. Fast-tracked through command approval because of his scores. It wasn't unheard of, but it felt wrong. Too soon. Too familiar. She cornered the operations clerk, demanding an explanation. "Orders came from higher up," he said. "Voluntary deployment," he requested it. Her pulse quickened. "Where?" The clerk hesitated. "Murren Valley." She froze. The same valley, the same soil, the same ghosts. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady. "Who approved this?" "Colonel Barrett," he said. "Apparently, Parker made a strong case, said he wanted to finish what was left undone." Lara stood there for a long time, the air in the room turning thin. She didn't even realize she was gripping the counter until her knuckles went white. She walked out without another word. That night she found herself back at the range again, the storm gone, the ground still wet. She set up one target, just one, and fired until her shoulder ached. Every shot was perfect. Every shot hurt. When the last shell hit the dirt, she whispered into the darkness, "You don't even know what you're chasing, kid." She went back to her quarters, pulled the journal from her bag, and opened it to the last page. Her grandfather's line glared back at her. "The hunter who moves first loses." But beneath it, her own handwriting, a note she'd written months ago, almost forgotten. "But the hunter who never stops loses more." She stared at it for a long time. Then she tore a small piece of paper from the back of the book and began to write. "Parker, if you ever find yourself watching the wind instead of listening to it, stop. If you start believing patience means waiting for revenge, stop. You're not hunting ghosts. You're building new ones. Remember, silence isn't peace until you've earned it. LQ." She folded it carefully, sealed it in an envelope, and left it with the deployment clerk. "Next mail drop," she said. "Personal correspondence. Urgent." He nodded, curious but too disciplined to ask. That night she couldn't shake the image, Eli in the same valley, the same ridges, the same trap she once lived through. The thought made her chest tighten. Not fear, not guilt. Something more complicated, like watching your reflection walk into a storm you barely survived. She lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, the wind howling softly outside. Somewhere far away, in a valley that refused to forget, a new hunter was waiting for his first silence. And Lara knew that silence all too well. She closed her eyes and whispered into the dark, "Don't move first." But she knew he would. Because that's what happens when ghosts teach the living how to shoot. How do you save someone who's walking the same path that nearly destroyed you? 3 weeks after Eli Parker deployed to Murren Valley, the first message arrived. Short, formal, the kind that left more unsaid than written. To Staff SGT, Lara Quinn. From Advisory Command, Murren Operations. Subject, Unit Status Confidential. PFC Parker performing beyond expectation. Leading local unit in counter-sniper exercises. High morale, minimal casualties, progress exceeding projections. Lara read it twice. It should have been good news. But she'd learned to distrust perfect reports. Her instincts whispered what paper never said, that something underneath was breaking. 2 weeks later, another message came. This one wasn't from command. It was handwritten, folded, smudged, sent through an unofficial channel, her letter. The one she'd written to Eli. It came back unopened. She stared at it for a long time, fingers trembling slightly as she turned it over. Across the seal, someone had scribbled 2 words, "No longer here." Her stomach dropped. That night she found herself walking again, the same perimeter fence, the same boots, the same wind pressing against her face. She told herself it was just a transfer, a reassignment, nothing more. But in her chest, the truth was already forming, cold, certain, heavy. 2 days later, confirmation arrived through official channels. Incident report, Murren Province. Advisory patrol compromised during engagement near Western Ridge. 2 casualties. 1 confirmed KIA, PFC Eli Parker. Details classified pending investigation. She didn't read the rest. She didn't have to. The Valley had claimed another one. For the first time in years, Lara felt something break inside her, quietly, completely. It wasn't just grief. It was recognition, because she'd seen this ending before, written it herself years ago when she decided that silence could heal. But silence, she realized now, only delays the echoes. That night she sat in her quarters with her grandfather's journal open on her lap. The pages were damp, rain or tears, she couldn't tell. Her eyes fell on that one sentence she could never escape. "The hunter who moves first loses." She whispered into the stillness, "Then what do you call the one who waits too long?" Her transfer request went in the next morning. No permission, no debate, just a single line in the remarks field. Returning to Murren as civilian consultant, for closure. Command tried to deny it. She didn't wait for approval. Some debts, she decided, don't require permission to pay. Within a week she was there again. Murren Valley, the place where wind remembered voices. The mountains looked the same, jagged, scorched, unwilling to change. But the base had shifted, new faces, new tents, new routines built over old ghosts. She reported to Colonel Raffick, the same commander she'd worked with months earlier. His face carried fresh lines, new fatigue. "I heard about Parker," she said quietly. Raffick nodded slowly. He was gifted, too young to know that gift can turn cruel. "What happened?" He sighed. He disobeyed protocol, broke formation, went after a sniper pair alone, said he had their pattern mapped. We told him to wait, he didn't. Lara closed her eyes. Raffick continued, voice heavy. "When the team reached his position, both shooters were dead. Parker was hit once. No radio, no distress call, died before evac." The silence that followed pressed like stone between them. Finally, Raffick said softly, "He reminded me of you." Lara opened her eyes. "He shouldn't have." He frowned. "You trained him well." "Maybe too well," she said. She left the command tent and walked into the open valley air. Every sound felt amplified, the crunch of gravel, the distant hum of generators, the soft whistle of wind through the rocks. The ridge where Eli fell was less than 2 miles west. She climbed alone. The terrain was familiar, cruelly so. Every curve of stone, every shadow looked like an echo of her own past. At the top, she found the scar in the dirt, a shallow depression lined with spent casings. The wind had already started to cover it with dust, like time trying to erase its evidence. She knelt beside it, tracing her gloved hand over the marks. Then she saw it, something half buried near the edge. A bullet casing, polished brass. Not military issue. Her stomach tightened. She pulled it free and turned it over. The base was engraved with a symbol, a faint scorpion, coiled and striking. Her breath caught. That insignia. The same one from years before. The same one she thought she'd buried with the man in Vadran Gorge. She scanned the ridgeline, eyes narrowing. It didn't make sense. That cell was gone, wiped out. The last of them dead or hunted down years ago. Unless. She looked back at the casing, her mind racing. Private contractors, mercenaries, ghost remnants of old wars still trading in silence. Someone was still out here, still playing the same game. She whispered, "It never ends, does it?" The radio on her shoulder crackled. Rafik's voice came through faintly. "Quinn, you good?" She hesitated, still staring at the brass. Not yet. That night she returned to the base, exhaustion weighing her down. She couldn't shake the thought that Eli hadn't just been reckless. He'd been lured. The same way she once had been, by a pattern, by the illusion of control. She reviewed the incident files until dawn. Every detail, every coordinate. The enemy's firing points mirrored the same rotation cycle from the original Vadran pattern, as if someone had studied her work, inverted it, and laid it like a trap. It was deliberate, personal. And in that realization came something she hadn't felt in years: anger. Not at the enemy, not even at the system. At herself, for thinking peace could be permanent while the ghost she'd made still roamed free. She took a vehicle out before sunrise, armed with only a sidearm, a small pack, and her grandfather's journal. She didn't tell Rafik. She didn't ask for permission. The valley was silent again, the kind of silence that breathes before breaking. She reached the ridge just as the light crept over the horizon. From there, she could see everything: the old hide sites, the kill zone, the long stretch of dirt road where Eli had made his last stand. She set the journal down, opened it to the first page, and whispered, "I'm done letting the dead speak louder than the living." Then she waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, heat shimmering across the stones. Her breathing slowed, body sinking into stillness. She didn't know what she was waiting for: a sign, a ghost, maybe just forgiveness. Then faintly through the scope of her binoculars she saw it, a flicker of movement across the opposite ridge. Not fast, careful, deliberate. Someone was there. She adjusted the focus. A figure half camouflaged, moving with precision, civilian gear, contractor grade. Her chest tightened. It couldn't be. The man paused, scanning the valley through his scope, the same way she had years ago. And then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned. Their eyes met across the distance. Two ghosts, two survivors of the same language of silence. He didn't raise his weapon, neither did she. They just stared, a silent acknowledgement between predators who'd both lost more than they'd ever won. The wind shifted. The man stepped back, fading into the rocks. "Gone." Lara exhaled slowly. She didn't chase, she didn't move. Because she finally understood. This was never about hunting anymore. It was about release. She picked up the journal, closed it, and stood. Her knees ached, her body tired, but her mind for once felt clear. As she descended the ridge, the valley seemed quieter. Not haunting quiet, peaceful quiet. When she reached the base, Rafik met her halfway. "You went up there, didn't you?" She nodded. "Find what you were looking for." She looked toward the mountains one last time. "I found what I needed to leave behind." That night she sat by the fire with the small group of soldiers still awake. None of them knew who she really was, not entirely. They just saw a woman with steady hands and eyes that carried too many stories. One of them asked softly, "What's it like, ma'am, to be a sniper?" She thought for a long time before answering. "It's like holding your breath while the world decides if it's worth saving." No one spoke after that. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the valley, and for the first time in her life, Lara felt like she wasn't being watched. Maybe the ghosts had finally turned away. Or maybe, finally, they trusted her to keep the silence. How do you say goodbye to a life that taught you everything, except how to live? The flight home was quiet. Lara sat near the window, staring at the patchwork of clouds drifting below like soft scars across the earth. The hum of the engines was steady, soothing, almost like breathing. She thought about all the times she'd flown that same route, the same sky, always leaving something behind. This time she promised herself she wouldn't. When the plane touched down in Wyoming, the wind met her like an old friend, cold, dry, familiar. The air smelled of sage and soil, the same scent that had raised her, the same air her grandfather used to call honest air. She rented a truck and drove through the open plains toward the foothills, where the horizon never seemed to end. Every mile felt like a lifetime she hadn't lived. By dusk, she reached the small wooden house that had been her family's for generations, her grandfather's home. The porch creaked when she stepped onto it. The paint was faded, the swing hung crooked, but it was still standing like him in a way, still watching. Inside, everything was where her mother had left it. The old rifle rack, the tin coffee pot, a faded photograph of Miles Quinn in uniform, young and unbroken. She set her duffel on the floor, placed her grandfather's journal gently on the table, and just stood there, breathing in the ghosts that weren't ghosts anymore. That night she lit the small stove and made coffee the way he used to, thick, bitter, grounding. She sat by the window, the darkness outside stretching forever, and opened the journal for the last time. Some pages were worn smooth from her fingers, the ink almost invisible. Others still smelled faintly of desert sand. But tonight, one page she'd never noticed caught her eye. Near the back, almost hidden, a note scrawled in the corner, written in his small, deliberate hand. Every hunter must learn when to stop tracking, or the hunt will turn inward. She traced the words with her thumb, her eyes burning. She whispered, "I should have listened sooner." Outside, the wind rose, brushing through the dry grass, carrying with it the faint whistle of something like memory. For the first time in years, she didn't mistake it for ghosts. It was just the wind. The next morning, she drove into town. The small shooting range on the edge of the valley hadn't changed much, a few new targets, a fresh coat of paint on the shack. The owner, a man named Lowell who'd been there since she was a teenager, looked up in surprise when she walked in. "Lara Quinn," he said, smiling. "Well, I'll be damned. Thought the army had you chained somewhere overseas." "Not anymore," she said. He looked her over, saw the calm in her eyes, the steadiness in her posture. "You here to shoot or teach?" She paused, maybe both. Within weeks, she was working part-time, instructing local deputies, hunters, and a few eager high schoolers whose parents trusted her name more than their own courage. She didn't wear her uniform, didn't talk about medals, didn't mention the valley. She just taught them what her grandfather had taught her, how to breathe with the wind, how to listen to the land, how to understand that the quiet isn't your enemy. Sometimes, when the light hit the range just right, she could almost see him, old Miles Quinn, standing beside her, nodding silently as another generation learned how not to waste their shots. It was during one of those sessions that she noticed a girl, maybe 17, watching from the fence line. No rifle, just a notebook. When the others left, Lara walked over. "You're not here to shoot." The girl shook her head shyly. "I want to learn, but not about guns, about patience." Lara tilted her head. "That's harder." The girl smiled faintly. "You're the one from the stories, right? The sniper who ended the killings." Lara's throat tightened. She'd heard the stories, too, the ones the army turned into legends. She never corrected them, but she never believed them either. "I was there," she said softly. "That's all." The girl hesitated. "My brother, he was stationed in Murren. He said you trained his friend, Eli." The name hit her like a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The girl continued. "He said Eli used to talk about you all the time. Said you taught him that fear wasn't weakness, it was proof he still cared." Lara looked out across the range. The wind was light, the air clear. "He learned that himself," she whispered. The girl smiled. "He told my brother that you saved him, not by teaching him to shoot, but by teaching him to listen." Something inside Lara shifted, not pain, not pride, something gentler. Acceptance, maybe. She nodded. Then he finally heard what I was trying to say. They stood in silence for a while. The girl looked at her curiously. "Can you teach me?" Lara thought about it. All the years she'd spent teaching soldiers to hit what they aimed at. Maybe now it was time to teach someone how not to pull the trigger. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "Bring your notebook." The girl's smile was small but sure. "Yes, ma'am." When she was gone, Lara stayed on the range. The sun hung low, bleeding orange over the mountains. The same mountains her grandfather used to call truth in stone. She sat on the bench, journal in her lap, and opened to the last page again. Beneath her grandfather's words, there was still a sliver of blank space left, untouched after all these years. She picked up her pen and wrote slowly, deliberately. "The hunter who moves first loses. The one who never stops loses more. But the one who finally listens wins peace." She closed the journal gently and looked out toward the horizon. The range was empty now, just wind and distance and a quiet that finally felt earned. She thought of all the people whose stories had crossed hers: Hayes, Rafik, Roar, Eli, her grandfather. None of them truly gone, just folded into the silence. Later that night, back at the house, she sat on the porch under a sky full of stars. The air was cool, the grass swaying in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, steady, rhythmic, alive. She leaned back in the creaking chair and whispered into the open air, "You were right, Grandpa. The land remembers, but sometimes it forgives too." The wind carried her words away, soft and unhurried. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a sniper or a soldier. She felt like someone who had finally stopped tracking ghosts and started listening to what came after them. In the days that followed, she kept teaching. Not just about rifles, but about patience, awareness, compassion. About how every decision, no matter how small, echoes somewhere you'll never see. Her students started calling her Ma'am Quinn. The nickname made her smile. One afternoon, while cleaning her rifle for the last time, she caught her reflection in the metal, lined, calm, but not hardened. The eyes looking back weren't those of a hunter anymore. They were of someone who had survived the hunt. She set the rifle down, wiped her hands clean, and stepped outside into the light. A storm was rolling in from the west, the air humming with thunder. The same kind of storm she used to hide from. But this time she didn't seek cover. She stood still, face tilted toward the sky, letting the rain fall. Every drop felt like memory washing clean. As the first lightning flash split the horizon, she whispered something she hadn't said in years. A small prayer, not for victory, not for forgiveness, but for quiet courage. "To all the hunters still out there," she said softly, "find your stillness before it finds you." The storm answered with silence. When she walked back inside, the journal still sat open on the table. The last line she'd written caught her eye again. "The one who finally listens wins peace." She closed the cover and smiled faintly. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.